The wind howled like a beast over the frozen wastelands of Vecthar. Ethan Cross, a human scavenger and ex-soldier, moved through the blinding snowstorm, his body wrapped tightly in a tattered thermal cloak. His boots crunched against the thick ice beneath him, every step sending a sharp jolt through his already exhausted body. The planet was merciless, a graveyard of ice and broken ships, but Ethan had survived worse. His thermal scanner flickered with weak life signs in the distance. That was unusual. Nothing living could survive out here for long. His supplies were running low, and his ship had taken damage from a crash landing. But that signal, it was hope. Pushing forward through the storm, he finally saw her, a figure half buried in the snow. Ethan's heart pounded as he rushed to her side, brushing away the frost clinging to her bruised, pale blue skin. She was an alien, her features delicate but regal, with long silver hair frozen in icy strands around her face. She barely breathed. He hesitated. She was not human, but she was alive. And that was all that mattered. Against his better judgment, Ethan lifted her into his arms. She was so light, fragile even, and her skin was like ice. He wrapped his cloak around her and carried her back to his makeshift camp, a small cave sheltered from the worst of the storm. Inside, the fire flickered weakly, struggling against the cold, but it was enough to bring warmth. Ethan laid her down carefully, checking her wounds. Deep bruises, cuts, she had been beaten, left for dead. Whoever she was, someone had wanted her to die alone in this frozen wasteland. He injected a weak stimulant into her arm, hoping it would help stabilize her. Hours passed. Then, at last, she stirred. Her violet eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion and fear. The moment she saw him, she tensed, trying to move away despite her weakness. "You're human." Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from the cold. Ethan sighed, knowing exactly what she was thinking. Humans were not trusted in the galaxy. To most alien species, they were seen as unpredictable, violent, and dangerous. "Yeah, and I just saved your life, so maybe don't look at me like I'm about to eat you," he muttered, tossing more fuel into the fire. She didn't respond, but her gaze remained wary. He couldn't blame her. For the next few hours, she remained silent, watching him with cautious eyes as he worked on repairing his ship's damaged communicator. But his gut told him something was wrong. And when his scanner picked up an approaching signal, one that didn't belong to him, his suspicions were confirmed. Drones. Not just any drones. Solarian assassin drones, armed with plasma cannons and heat-seeking tech. Someone powerful wanted this woman dead, and they had sent machines to finish the job. Ethan turned to her. "All right, lady, you need to tell me exactly who you are. Right now." She hesitated, then finally whispered, "I am Elvira, mother of the Solarian king." Ethan's stomach dropped. Of all the people he could have saved, it had to be the mother of a powerful alien ruler. And now, he was in the middle of a kill order meant for her. The storm raged outside as the first drone descended, scanning for signs of life. Ethan grabbed his rifle, his instincts kicking in. He had fought in wars before. He had survived worse odds. He wasn't about to die here, on some frozen rock, because he chose to help the wrong person. The moment the drone's targeting system locked onto their cave, he fired first. A precise shot to its optical sensor sent it crashing into the snow, but more were coming. Elvira gasped, gripping his arm. "They will not stop until I am dead." "Yeah, well, they'll have to get through me first." Ethan packed up his gear, grabbing a second weapon and tossing it to her. "Can you fight?" She hesitated, then took the gun. "I will try." No time for doubts. They needed to move. They fought their way through the storm, taking cover behind ice formations as the drones closed in. Ethan's experience kept them alive. Quick reflexes, precise shots, and brutal efficiency. Elvira, though weaker, adapted fast, her royal training kicking in. She was no soldier, but she was determined. By the time they reached the wreckage of an old Silurian warship, Ethan was bleeding from a deep cut on his side, and Elvira was shivering from exhaustion. Inside the wreckage, they took a brief moment to breathe. Ethan turned to her, pressing cloth to his wound. "Why does your own people want you dead?" She looked away. "My son has betrayed me." The word hung heavy between them. She explained how a coup had taken place, how those loyal to her had been slaughtered, and how she had barely escaped with her life. Ethan wasn't sure why it angered him so much, but something about the way she spoke, the pain in her voice, made him want to protect her even more. "Then we take your throne back," he said simply. She stared at him, shocked. "You would risk your life for me?" Ethan smirked. "Lady, I already did." They made their move at dawn. The storm had cleared, and the frozen wasteland stretched endlessly before them. But they were not alone. A Silurian ship descended, landing with heavy force. From its doors stepped the last person Elvira expected to see. Her son. His expression was cold, his golden armor gleaming under the pale sun. "Mother," he said, voice devoid of warmth. "You should have stayed dead." Ethan's grip tightened around his rifle. He knew exactly where this was going. The fight was brutal. Ethan faced off against Silurian soldiers, dodging plasma fire while using every bit of his training to stay alive. Elvira fought too, her royal blood giving her the strength to stand against her son's betrayal. But the prince was powerful, and he had numbers on his side. Ethan took a hard hit to the chest, falling onto the frozen ground, gasping for air. The prince loomed over him, sword raised for the final strike. Elvira screamed. But Ethan wasn't done yet. With one last burst of strength, he activated his last explosive charge, sending the prince flying back. Gasping, Ethan pushed himself up, pain radiating through his body. The prince, wounded but alive, tried to rise. But Elvira stood over him now, her weapon aimed at his heart. "This is your last chance," she said, voice steady. "Call off your army." The prince hesitated. Then, seeing the fire in her eyes, he dropped his weapon. The battle was over. Ethan collapsed, barely conscious. The last thing he saw was Elvira rushing to him, her expression filled with something he had never seen before. Not fear, not hatred, but something else. When he woke, it was to the sound of a soft voice calling his name. He was no longer in the snow. He was somewhere warm, safe. Elvira sat beside him, her hand resting gently over his. "You survived," she whispered. Ethan chuckled weakly. "Told you I would." Peace had been restored. Elvira had reclaimed her place, and Ethan had found something he never expected, a reason to stay. And maybe, just maybe, something more. The fire crackled softly, casting a faint glow on the icy walls of the cave. Ethan Cross sat near the entrance, his rifle resting across his lap as he kept watch. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the temperature dropped lower with every passing hour. But his mind wasn't on the storm. His eyes kept drifting toward the woman lying near the fire, wrapped in his spare blanket. Elvira. Even in her weakened state, there was something regal about her. The delicate features of her pale blue face, the silver strands of her hair catching the firelight, and the faint but unmistakable air of authority around her. But now, that pride was mixed with pain. Her skin was bruised, and her body bore the unmistakable signs of starvation and exhaustion. Despite that, when her violet eyes opened, there was still a fire in them. When she caught him looking, her voice was quiet but sharp. "Why did you save me?" Ethan shrugged, keeping his tone light. Seemed like the right thing to do. Her brow furrowed. "Humans don't do the right thing. Not when it comes to my people." He couldn't help but smirk. "And yet here I am, keeping you warm and alive. Strange, isn't it?" She didn't answer. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind's distant scream. Ethan didn't push. He could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her body trembled despite the heat. She needed rest more than answers. Over the next few hours, he kept himself busy. He managed to fix part of his ship's comm system, though it was still too weak to send a signal. Supplies were running low. They couldn't stay here for long. And then there was the problem of the drones. He knew they'd be back. Whoever had sent them wouldn't give up so easily. As he worked, he kept an eye on her. She slept fitfully, her body too weak to fully relax. When she finally stirred again, it was with a soft, pained sound. Ethan moved closer, offering her a canteen of water. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his as she drank. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice softer now. He nodded. "You're welcome." They didn't speak much at first. Elvira's suspicion was clear in every glance, every tense movement. But as the hours turned into days, things began to change. Ethan hunted what little game survived in this frozen wasteland, bringing back enough food to keep them both going. He shared his rations without complaint, and when her strength allowed, she helped him with the fire and repairs. It was during one of those quiet moments, when they sat close to the fire, that she finally spoke. "My name is Elvira," she said quietly, "mother of the Xalorian king." Ethan's hand froze halfway to his mouth. He set down his food slowly, trying to process what she just said. "Your royalty." "Was," she corrected bitterly. "My son, he has turned against me." A rival faction convinced him that I was a threat to his rule. They overthrew me. My guards were killed, my allies scattered, and I was left here to die. Ethan stared at her, anger bubbling in his chest. He didn't know much about Xalorians, but leaving someone, anyone, to die in a place like this, that was beyond cruel. "They sent those drones after you," he said. "It wasn't a question." She nodded. "They will keep hunting me until they are sure I am dead." He took a slow breath, weighing his options. "Well," he said finally, "they're going to be disappointed." Her eyes snapped to his. You don't have to stay, human. You've done more than enough. If you leave now, you might still escape them." Ethan grinned, leaning back against the cave wall. "Yeah, well, I've never been much for running away." For the first time, her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. It was gone in a second, but he saw it, and something warm stirred in his chest. As the days passed, their bond grew. Elvira's strength slowly returned, and with it, so did pieces of her personality. She was proud and sharp-tongued, but there was kindness beneath the armor. She asked about Earth, about his life before becoming a scavenger. In turn, she told him about Xalar, its beauty, its traditions, and the pain of her betrayal. "I love my son," she said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "I raised him to be strong, but I never thought he would become this." Ethan didn't know what to say, so he didn't speak. Instead, he reached out, his hand covering hers gently. She didn't pull away. The next morning, danger found them again. The sound of engines echoed through the sky. Ethan's scanner flared to life. A Xalorian patrol ship was closing in fast. He grabbed his gear, adrenaline spiking. "We need to move. Now." They pushed through the snow, Ethan leading the way as they made for a nearby canyon. But the ship was fast, and within minutes, it was on them. Drones descended, weapons glowing. Ethan fired first. The blast took out the lead drone, sending it crashing into the ice. But there were more. Too many more. He took cover behind a jagged outcropping, pulling Elvira down beside him. "You ever use one of these?" he asked, handing her his backup pistol. She took it without hesitation. "I am not completely helpless." "Good," he said, grinning despite the danger, "because we're about to get very popular." The fight was brutal. Plasma bolts scorched the ice, explosions sending shards flying through the air. Ethan moved fast, taking down drones with practiced precision. Elvira covered him, her aim surprisingly steady. But they were being overwhelmed. "Ethan," she called, fear in her voice. He turned just in time to see a drone dive toward her. And without thinking, he threw himself into its path. The blast hit him hard, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain flared through his side, but he stayed conscious, forcing himself to his knees. Elvira was beside him in an instant, her hands pressing against his wound. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please." He wanted to tell her it was okay, that he'd been through worse, but his vision was starting to blur. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the fierce determination in her eyes. When he woke, it was to warmth and the soft sound of crackling flames. He was back in the cave, his wound bandaged and his body wrapped in blankets. Elvira sat beside him, her hand resting over his. "You're alive," she whispered, relief shining in her eyes. "Wouldn't miss it," he rasped, his throat dry. She smiled, a real smile this time, and it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Cross felt like he belonged. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't so alone anymore. The storm had finally passed, but the sense of danger hadn't. The wind no longer howled, and the blinding snow had settled into an eerie stillness. Ethan Cross stood at the edge of the cave, his eyes scanning the icy horizon. The quiet was unsettling. It wasn't peace, it was the calm before the storm. Behind him, Elvira moved slowly, her strength still returning. She no longer looked like the fragile woman he had pulled from the snow, but there was a weariness in her every step. She approached him, her voice soft. "You feel it too, don't you?" He nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "They're coming." He didn't have to wait long for confirmation. The sound came first, a low hum, like a swarm of angry wasps. Then the flicker of movement on the horizon. Ethan's scanner flared to life, showing the unmistakable heat signatures of incoming ships. A strike team. And they weren't here for negotiations. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. "I won't hide," Elvira said, her violet eyes flashing with defiance. He almost smiled. "Good. Then stay close." The ships descended like birds of prey, sleek and deadly. The moment they touched down, the air shimmered, cloaked assassins fanning out across the ice. Ethan's fingers tightened around his weapon. He had faced enemies like these before. They were fast, ruthless, and nearly invisible, but they weren't unstoppable. The first shot cracked through the air, and Ethan moved. He pushed Elvira behind a jagged ice formation, rolling as plasma bolts scorched the ground where he'd stood. The hiss of a cloaking field deactivating was the only warning he had before an assassin lunged at him. Ethan met the attack head-on. His blade flashed, catching the faint shimmer of his opponent's form. The alien fell with a gurgled cry, but there was no time to celebrate. Another enemy was already closing in. Ethan fired his rifle, the shot lighting up the ice with a brilliant blue flash. The fight became a blur of motion and sound. Ethan's training took over. Every move calculated, every strike precise. He used the terrain to his advantage, laying traps and leading the assassins into ambushes. The air was filled with the sound of battle, the hiss of deactivating cloaks, the crack of gunfire, and the sharp clash of blades. But there were too many of them. He didn't see the war machine until it was too late. It burst through the ice like a nightmare, a towering construct of metal and hate, its eyes glowing with cold intelligence. Ethan barely had time to react before it fired. The blast sent him flying, pain flaring through his body as he hit the ground hard. "Ethan." Elvira's voice broke through the haze of agony. He forced himself to his knees, his vision swimming. The war machine advanced, its weapon charging for another shot. Ethan raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking. He knew he wouldn't be fast enough. And then the shot never came. Elvira stepped between him and the machine, her eyes blazing. She raised her hands, and for the first time, Ethan saw what real Solarian power looked like. The air around her crackled with energy, and with a single furious gesture, she unleashed it. Lightning danced across the ice, striking the machine with a deafening crack. The construct shuddered, its systems shorting out before it collapsed with a final mechanical groan. Ethan stared, his breath ragged. "Remind me never to make you angry." But there was no humor in Elvira's face. She was already at his side, her hands pressing against his wound. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not so bad," he lied. Blood stained the ice beneath him. His vision was growing darker with every second. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the look on her face. For the first time, the proud and regal Elvira looked afraid. "Stay with me," she pleaded. "Please, Ethan, don't leave me." He wanted to answer, to tell her he wasn't going anywhere. But the darkness was too strong, and this time, it pulled him under. When he woke, it was to warmth and the soft scent of something floral. He blinked against the dim light, his body heavy and sore. A gentle hand brushed against his forehead, and when he turned his head, he found Elvira sitting beside him. "You're alive," she whispered, her eyes shining with relief. "Wouldn't miss it," he rasped, his throat dry. She helped him sit up, her hand steadying him. The cave was quiet now, the battle long over. "You shouldn't have fought them alone," she said softly. He smiled, despite the pain. Seemed like the right thing to do. Her eyes softened. "Why? Why would you risk your life for me?" "Because no one deserves to be left behind," he said simply. "Not even a queen." She looked away, but not before he saw the tears in her eyes. "I was nothing more than a burden. Even my own son saw me as disposable." "Well, your son's an idiot." The words startled a laugh out of her. A soft, broken sound that made his chest ache for reasons that had nothing to do with his injuries. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "You're not like the stories," she whispered. "They said humans were savage, cruel. But you saved me. You protected me when no one else would." He held her gaze. "Maybe it's time to write a new story." The space between them grew smaller. Ethan's heart pounded, but not from fear. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the battle between caution and hope. And then she leaned in, her lips brushing softly against his. It was over too soon. When she pulled back, her face was flushed, but there was no regret in her eyes, only warmth. "Rest," she said softly, her fingers lingering against his cheek. "You're safe now." For the first time in a long time, Ethan believed it. And maybe, just maybe, safety wasn't such a lonely place after all. The wind had died down, but the cold remained, a biting reminder that their struggle was far from over. Ethan Cross's wounds still ached, every step slow and deliberate, but they had no time to rest. The enemy was closing in. They needed shelter, supplies, and a plan. Elvira walked beside him, her pale blue skin glowing faintly against the icy backdrop. She was no longer the fragile woman he'd pulled from the snow. With Ethan's guidance, she had grown stronger, and now she carried one of his spare weapons with surprising confidence. "Are you sure you're up for this?" he asked, his voice rough with pain. "I don't have a choice," she replied softly. "If they find us, they will kill us both. I will not stand by and let that happen." Despite the danger, Ethan smiled. "You're learning fast. I had a good teacher." Their eyes met for a moment, and something passed between them. An understanding born of survival and trust. But there was no time for words. The sound of distant engines rumbled through the air. They were being hunted. They pushed forward, climbing over frozen ridges and across treacherous ice fields. Every step drained Ethan's strength, but he refused to stop. Elvira stayed close, helping him when he stumbled, her touch gentle but determined. Hours later, they found it. An abandoned outpost, half buried in snow and ice. The structure was old, but intact. Ethan's scanner detected no life signs, but that didn't mean it was safe. "We should rest," Elvira said, her voice tight with concern. Ethan shook his head. Not yet. We need to secure the perimeter first. He moved ahead, his weapon raised, but his vision blurred, and his knees buckled. Before he could fall, Elvira was there, catching him. "You're too weak," she whispered. "Let me help." He wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was too strong. With his guidance, Elvira cleared the outpost, room by room, step by step. She moved with a grace he hadn't expected, her fear replaced by determination. When they were finally safe, Ethan collapsed into a chair, his breath ragged. Elvira knelt beside him, her hands warm against his skin as she checked his wounds. "You shouldn't be pushing yourself like this," she said softly. "I'll be fine," he murmured. "We just need a plan." Before they could discuss one, the outpost's alarms blared. Ethan forced himself to his feet, his weapon ready. But when the door opened, it wasn't the assassins who stepped inside. He stepped into the outpost like he owned it, his golden armor gleaming, his eyes filled with cold contempt. Behind him, the last of his elite guards spread out, weapons raised. "End this," the prince ordered, and the guards advanced. The fight was brutal. Ethan took down one after another, his body moving on instinct even as exhaustion dragged at his limbs. Elvira fought beside him, her strikes deadly and precise, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. A plasma bolt grazed Ethan's side, and he stumbled. Elvira's cry of alarm was drowned out by the roar of weapons fire. She reached for him, but the prince's guard closed in, forcing them apart. And then the prince cornered her. "You should have stayed dead," he sneered, raising his weapon. Elvira stood her ground, but fear flashed in her eyes. She was out of ammunition, and there was nowhere left to run. Ethan saw it happen, and something inside him snapped. "No," he roared, and he charged. He moved without thinking, his battered body fueled by sheer desperation. Plasma bolts tore through the air, but he didn't stop. He slammed into the prince just as the weapon fired. The shot went wide, scorching the wall behind Elvira. The two men crashed to the ground in a brutal struggle. The prince was stronger, his armor giving him the advantage. But Ethan fought like a man with nothing left to lose. The prince's blade flashed, and pain exploded in Ethan's side. But he didn't let go. With a final, desperate effort, he drove his own knife up beneath the prince's armor. The prince's eyes went wide with shock. He tried to speak, but no words came. And then he fell still. Ethan collapsed beside him, his vision swimming. The pain was too much. He couldn't move, could barely breathe. Elvira was there in an instant, cradling him in her arms. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, Ethan, you can't leave me." He tried to smile, but the effort cost too much. "Guess. I finally ran out of luck," he murmured. "No," she said fiercely. "You don't get to die. Not after everything we've been through." He wanted to tell her how much she meant to him, how saving her had been the best thing he'd ever done. But the words wouldn't come. "Elvira," his voice was barely a whisper. "You're so beautiful." Tears streamed down her face as she held him tighter. "Don't you dare say goodbye. You're going to survive this. You have to." But the darkness was closing in, and Ethan couldn't fight it anymore. His eyes fluttered shut, his body going still. The battle had ended, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any war. The outpost lay in ruins, the air thick with the scent of burning metal, and the cold sting of blood and frost. Elvira knelt on the icy ground, cradling Ethan's broken body. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow. Every second that passed felt like sand slipping through her fingers. "No, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You can't leave me like this." Ethan didn't respond. His head lolled against her shoulder, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he was already gone. But then his chest rose, just barely, with a ragged breath. The sound of ships approaching broke through her desperation. She looked up, heart pounding, unsure if it was friend or foe. But when the ships landed and her people emerged, soldiers bearing the sigil of the Loyalist forces, hope flickered to life. "High Lady Elvira," one of them called, his voice filled with shock and reverence. "We thought you were dead." "I will be," she snapped, her voice fierce, "if you don't help him. Now." The medics rushed forward, carefully lifting Ethan onto a stretcher. Elvira never let go of his hand, her fingers tightening around his even as they carried him into the ship. The journey back to the capital was a blur. Fear and exhaustion clouded everything. When they arrived, Elvira's loyalists struck hard and fast. The coup fell apart without the prince's leadership. The usurpers were defeated, and Elvira's rightful place was restored. But none of it mattered. Not without Ethan. For hours, she paced outside the medical chamber, her mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. Every time the door opened, she held her breath. And every time, the news was the same. "He's critical. We're doing everything we can." But it wasn't enough. Desperation drove her to the Council of Healers, their wisdom and advanced technology, the most powerful in the Empire. "There must be something," she demanded. "He saved my life. Now you'll save his." "There is one option," one of them admitted reluctantly. "Experimental, dangerous, but if we do nothing, he will not survive the night." "Do it," she said without hesitation. The hours stretched on endlessly. Elvira never left the medical wing, never let go of the hope that somehow Ethan would pull through. She couldn't imagine a life without him. The human who had risked everything for her, who had fought by her side and taught her what strength and love truly meant. Finally, when she thought the waiting might break her entirely, the door opened. "He's stable," the healer said. "He's asking for you." Elvira didn't wait. She rushed inside, her heart pounding. And there he was, pale and weak, but alive. His eyes opened slowly, and when they met hers, a faint, familiar smile curved his lips. "Hey, princess," he whispered, his voice rough. The sound of it broke something inside her. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she knelt beside the bed, taking his hand in hers. "You idiot," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You scared me." "Sorry," he murmured. "Guess I'm not so easy to kill after all." She laughed, even as the tears kept falling. "You never were." His fingers brushed against her cheek, wiping away a tear. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I am now," she whispered. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The war was over, the danger past, but the bond they had forged in fire and blood remained, and in that quiet, there was something stronger than any words. I don't want to leave you," Ethan said finally, "but I don't belong here." "You belong with me," she said fiercely, "and I'll never let you go." He smiled, a tired, soft smile that still made her heart skip. Good. In the days that followed, the Empire began to rebuild. But Elvira stayed by Ethan's side, refusing to leave him until he was strong enough to stand. And when he finally did, the two of them stood together, a symbol of unity and hope for a future that they would build together. Peace had been restored, but their journey was just beginning. And no matter what lay ahead, Elvira knew one thing for certain. With Ethan by her side, there was nothing they couldn't face.